She was just another passenger in first class, quiet, polite, and waiting for her drink. But when the flight attendant reached her row, everything changed. The juice she had poured for every other passenger, suddenly unavailable, the service that came with a smile for everyone else, turned cold. And when the girl asked why, she was given nothing but excuses. What the flight attendant didn't know, she had just denied the daughter of the airline's owner, and the message the girl just sent was about to change everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more. The cabin buzzed with the soft hum of passengers settling into their seats, adjusting their bags, and flipping through in-flight magazines. The scent of fresh coffee and airline meals drifted through the air as the flight attendants moved efficiently down the aisles. Among them was Ms. Keaton, a senior flight attendant known for her strict demeanor. She carried herself with an air of authority, making sure everything ran exactly as she liked it. Her uniform was spotless, her posture rigid, and her eyes sharp as they scanned the first-class cabin. Near the window, a teenage girl, Zahara, sat quietly, her seatbelt fastened, her hands resting on her lap. She had boarded the flight alone, something she had done many times before, but this time felt different. There was an excitement in her chest, knowing she would soon reach her destination, where her father Idris was waiting. She wore a simple sweater and jeans. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. She wasn't the type to cause trouble, and she wasn't looking for any. A few minutes after takeoff, the flight attendants began their service. Ms. Keaton moved through the rows with practiced efficiency, greeting passengers with polite smiles and offering drinks from the silver tray in her hands. She poured fresh orange juice into a tall glass for the businessman in seat 1A, handed a sparkling water to the woman in 1B, and filled a crystal-clear goblet with apple juice for the man across the aisle. When she reached Zahara's seat, her smile faded slightly, her eyes flicking over her. There was a brief pause, so quick that most wouldn't have noticed, but Zahara did. "Can I have some orange juice, please?" Zahara asked, her voice polite. Ms. Keaton barely glanced at her as she straightened the tray in her hands. "We're only serving water right now," she replied curtly, before turning to the next passenger. Zahara blinked, confused. She had just watched the same woman pour 3 different types of juice for the passengers in front of her. She looked down at her tray table, where a glass of water had been placed without asking. Something felt off, but she brushed it aside. Maybe juice service would come later. A few minutes passed, and Ms. Keaton continued serving drinks, her tone light and friendly as she chatted with other passengers. Zahara watched as another flight attendant, a younger woman named Elise, came down the aisle holding a new tray. This one was filled with more juice options, pineapple, cranberry, and even a fancy fruit blend for those who requested it. One by one, the passengers around her received their drinks, the glasses clinking softly as they were placed on trays. Zahara waited. When Miss Keaton passed by again, Zahara tried once more, this time with a small smile. "Excuse me, could I have some juice now?" Miss Keaton stopped, turning back with an impatient look. "Like I said, we're only serving water for now." Zahara's stomach twisted. She wasn't the type to argue, but she wasn't imagining things. The man sitting 2 seats away had just received a glass of pineapple juice. The woman across the aisle was stirring ice cubes in a tall glass of apple juice. Zahara swallowed, keeping her voice steady. "I just saw you give juice to them." Miss Keaton's eyes narrowed slightly. Her fingers tightened around the tray, but her expression didn't change. "Look, young lady, I don't have time to go back and forth. We have limited supplies, and juice is reserved for first-class passengers." The words were sharp, but it wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. The condescending tone, the dismissive glance, the way she looked at Zahara like she was a problem that needed to be handled quickly. The man across the aisle shifted in his seat, glancing toward them before looking away, pretending not to notice. The woman near the front took a sudden interest in the safety pamphlet she had ignored earlier. Elise, who had been serving drinks nearby, hesitated mid-step, her brows drawing together, but she said nothing. Zahara felt her face grow warm, not just with confusion, but something else. It wasn't just about the juice anymore. It was about the fact that she had been the only one refused. that this woman had looked at her and, without asking questions, had decided she wasn't supposed to be here. She took a deep breath and picked up her phone, typing a quick message. "Dad, the flight attendant is refusing to serve me juice. Everyone else got one, but she told me it's only for first-class passengers." She pressed send, then locked the screen, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges of her phone. Ms. Keaton turned, walking back toward the galley without a second glance. She had no idea that the message Zahara just sent would change everything. Zahara placed her phone on her lap, her fingers gripping the edge of her tray table. The cabin around her felt colder now, the quiet hum of the plane unable to drown out the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. She stole a glance at the passengers around her, wondering if anyone had truly noticed what had happened. The businessman across the aisle adjusted his tie, pretending to focus on his laptop screen. The woman near the front sipped her drink slowly, eyes glued to the in-flight magazine. Nobody wanted to acknowledge it. They had seen it, but silence was easier. A soft vibration in her lap caught her attention. Her father, Idris, had replied. "What do you mean she refused?" "Did she say why?" Zahara hesitated before typing back. "She acted like I don't belong in first class. She said the juice is for first-class passengers only, but she gave it to everyone else." There was a long pause before the three dots appeared, indicating he was typing. Then the message came through. "What's the flight number?" Zahara's heart pounded as she quickly checked her boarding pass and sent him the details. Idris was never the type to react impulsively, but she knew him well enough to recognize when he was angry. His silence between messages wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. A few rows ahead, Elise walked toward the galley, her movements slower than usual. She had seen everything, and though she wasn't sure what she could do, the situation left a bitter taste in her mouth. Ms. Keaton had been with the airline for years, but this wasn't the first time Elise had witnessed her treating certain passengers differently. It was just the first time it had been this blatant. Inside the galley, Ms. Keaton casually poured herself a small cup of coffee, her expression calm. Elise hesitated before speaking. "Did that girl in 3A really not get any juice?" Ms. Keaton barely glanced up. "She asked after I had already served. I didn't have time to double back." Elise frowned, but there was still juice left. Ms. Keaton let out a small dismissive chuckle. "Look, Elise, you'll learn that some passengers like to test boundaries. She probably got that seat as a hand-me-down or through some mix-up. First-class service is for first-class passengers. It's not a buffet." Elise stiffened. "She is a first-class passenger." Ms. Keaton rolled her eyes. "I don't need a lecture. Go check on row 5. Elise hesitated but eventually walked away, though unease sat heavy in her chest. Something about this didn't feel right. Back in her seat, Zahara refreshed her phone screen, waiting for her father's response. When it finally came through, it was just 2 words. "Stay seated." Zahara exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure what her father was planning, but one thing was certain. Miss Keaton had just made a serious mistake. Zahara stared at her phone, her father's last message replaying in her mind. "Stay seated." Those 2 words carried more weight than anything else he could have said. She knew her father well. He wasn't the type to let things slide. If he had told her to stay put, it meant something was already in motion. She shifted in her seat, looking toward the front of the cabin where Miss Keaton was now chatting with another passenger. Her posture relaxed, as if she hadn't just humiliated someone. The sight of her acting so normal after what she had done made Zahara's stomach twist. Minutes passed. The flight attendants continued their service, offering refills to other passengers while Zahara's tray remained untouched. Elise walked by, her eyes lingering on Zahara's untouched glass of water before hesitantly looking away. She wanted to say something, but the tension in the cabin made it difficult. Then, an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Ms. Keaton, please report to the cockpit immediately." The sudden call made a few passengers glance up. Zahara's grip on her phone tightened. Up near the galley, Miss Keaton frowned, clearly surprised. Flight attendants didn't get called to the cockpit unless something was serious. She quickly smoothed her uniform, adjusting her collar before making her way to the front of the plane. Elise watched her go, her brows slightly furrowed. Inside the cockpit, the captain, Graham Foster, was seated with his hands folded neatly in front of him. His face was calm, But there was a seriousness in his eyes that made Ms. Keaton straighten her posture. On the screen of the in-flight phone, a man appeared, one Ms. Keaton instantly recognized as Damon Whitaker, the airline's senior operations manager. Ms. Keaton's confidence flickered for the first time. She had only spoken to Damon once before, and it wasn't under casual circumstances. The man's voice was crisp and direct. "Ms. Keaton, we have received a complaint regarding your in-flight service. A first-class passenger was denied a standard beverage request. Can you explain why?" Ms. Keaton stiffened, but she quickly forced a smile. "I assure you, sir, there was no refusal. We have a limited supply of beverages, and I simply hadn't gotten to her request yet." Damon's expression didn't change. "That's not the report we received." The air inside the cockpit felt heavier. Ms. Keaton's hands instinctively clasped in front of her, a habit she had whenever she was under pressure. "With all due respect, passengers misunderstand things all the time. I was simply following standard procedure." The captain, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Are you aware of who this passenger is?" Ms. Keaton frowned, glancing between them. I don't believe so." Damon leaned slightly closer to the screen. "Her name is Zahara Idris. Her father owns this airline." The words hit Ms. Keaton like a sudden drop in altitude. Her breath caught for just a second, but she recovered quickly, forcing a composed expression. No excuses." Damon's voice was sharp now. "You will return to your station immediately, provide the service that was requested, and issue an apology in front of the passengers." Ms. Keaton swallowed. This wasn't just an order. It was a warning. She nodded stiffly. "Understood." As she turned to leave the cockpit, her pulse pounded in her ears. She had spent years controlling passengers, ensuring they followed the rules of her cabin. But now, for the first time, she was the one being ordered to fix her mistake. And she had no idea what was waiting for her when she stepped back into the aisle. Ms. Keaton stepped out of the cockpit, her breath uneven as she forced herself to walk calmly back toward the first-class cabin. Her usual confidence felt shaken, replaced by a quiet panic clawing at her chest. She had handled difficult passengers before, but this wasn't just any passenger. This was the daughter of the man who controlled the entire airline. As she entered the aisle, she could feel the weight of passengers' eyes on her. Did they know? Had word already spread? Her face burned at the thought. She quickly straightened her uniform, smoothing her hands over the fabric as she neared Zahara's seat. Zahara, however, hadn't moved. She sat comfortably, her expression unreadable, her fingers resting lightly on her phone. Unlike Miss Keaton, she wasn't nervous. She wasn't unsettled. In fact, there was something calm, almost expectant, about the way she glanced up when Miss Keaton finally stopped in front of her. A forced smile appeared on Miss Keaton's lips. "Miss Idris, I apologize if there was a misunderstanding earlier. I'd be happy to bring you any drink you'd like." The words were polite, but Zahara could hear the tension beneath them, the stiffness in her voice, the hesitation in her posture. It wasn't genuine. This wasn't an apology. This was a flight attendant trying to clean up a mistake before it became something bigger. Zahara tilted her head slightly. "A misunderstanding?" Ms. Keaton nodded quickly, her fingers tightening around the tray she held. "Yes, of course. I didn't mean to cause any inconvenience." Zahara let the silence stretch just long enough for Ms. Keaton to shift uncomfortably. Then she spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "You didn't give anyone else water without asking. You didn't refuse anyone else juice. So what exactly was the misunderstanding?" The question made the air between them feel heavy. A few passengers subtly turned their heads, pretending not to listen, but their curiosity was obvious. Ms. Keaton's throat felt dry. She stopped, struggling to find an excuse. Any excuse, but there wasn't one. Zahara didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to argue. She had already won. Still, she wasn't going to let Miss Keaton slip away that easily. She folded her hands on her lap and spoke again, her words quiet yet impossible to ignore. "If you're going to apologize, at least be honest about why you made that choice." Miss Keaton's stomach twisted. For the first time, she felt small. The young girl in front of her had turned the power dynamic completely around. The same passengers who had ignored the situation earlier were now watching intently, waiting to see what would happen next. A deep, unsettling realization sank into Miss Keaton's chest. She had misjudged Zahara, and now everyone could see it. Miss Keaton stood frozen for a moment, gripping the tray so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. The weight of Zahara's words settled over her like a heavy fog, thick and inescapable. Passengers who had once ignored the situation were now watching intently, their gazes flicking between the two. Some pretended to be occupied with their books or screens, but their curiosity was unmistakable. Zahara didn't break eye contact. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't demand anything. She simply waited. She wanted Ms. Keaton to acknowledge what had really happened, not just cover it up with empty words, not just try to fix the problem without addressing the real issue. Ms. Keaton inhaled sharply, trying to regain control of the moment. "I may have misjudged the situation," she said carefully, forcing a neutral tone. "I assure you it wasn't intentional." Zahara raised an eyebrow. "Wasn't it?" That single question made Ms. Keaton's stomach tighten. She glanced around, searching for an escape from the pressure mounting around her. But there was none. The cabin was silent, all eyes on her. Elise, the younger flight attendant, stood near the galley, her arms folded as she observed the exchange. She had seen enough to know what was really happening. Ms. Keaton wasn't apologizing because she had suddenly realized her mistake. She was apologizing because she had been caught. For the first time, Ms. Keaton noticed the shift in the cabin. The control she once had was slipping. She had always been the authority figure in first class, the one who set the rules, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly. But now the balance had changed. She wasn't in control anymore. Zahara watched her, waiting for something real, something meaningful, but she already knew she wasn't going to get it. Ms. Keaton was too proud, too stuck in her ways to admit what she had really done. After a long pause, Zahara exhaled and reached for her phone. She tapped out a quick message to her father. "She's apologizing, but she's not admitting what she did." A response came almost instantly. "Understood." That was all he said, but it was enough. Zahara set her phone back down and looked up at Miss Keaton again, her expression unreadable. "Fine, I'll have the orange juice." Miss Keaton nodded stiffly, eager to move past the moment. She turned quickly, heading toward the galley, her legs feeling strangely unsteady. As she disappeared behind the curtain, Elise followed her, unable to stay silent any longer. "You should have just told her the truth." Miss Keaton spun around, her voice sharp. "I don't need a lecture from you, Elise." Elise shook her head. "No, what you need is to realize that you didn't just misjudge her. You saw a young black girl in first class, and you assumed she didn't belong. You didn't check her ticket, you didn't ask questions, you just decided." Ms. Keaton's jaw clenched. "I said I apologized." Elise scoffed. "No, you didn't. You just tried to make it go away." Ms. Keaton opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of the intercom crackling to life cut through the air. "Ms. Keaton, please report to the cockpit immediately." Elise's expression didn't change. "Looks like you're not done answering for this." Miss Keaton's stomach dropped as she walked out of the galley for the second time that day, feeling the full weight of what was coming next. Ms. Keaton's legs felt heavier with each step toward the cockpit. Her breath was shallow, her mind racing as she tried to anticipate what was waiting for her on the other side of that door. She had been called once already, and that had been bad enough. But a second call? That meant something had escalated. Passengers turned their heads slightly as she passed, some pretending to be focused on their screens, while others barely hid their curiosity. Zahara remained seated, calm as ever, her fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. She wasn't smiling, wasn't smirking, wasn't even looking at Miss Keaton anymore. That made it worse. If she had been gloating, Miss Keaton could have convinced herself that this was just a spoiled child making trouble. But Zahara wasn't reacting at all. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done. Miss Keaton swallowed hard as she reached the cockpit door and knocked twice before stepping inside. Captain Graham Foster sat in his seat, his expression unreadable. The screen of the in-flight phone was still active, and Damon Whitaker, the airline's senior operations manager, was still on the line. But this time, there was someone else. A second figure appeared on the screen, one that made the air in the cockpit feel heavier. Idris, the man who owned the airline, the man who controlled every flight, every employee, every decision made within the company. And most importantly, the man who had just received a direct complaint about her. Ms. Keaton felt her mouth go dry. Idris was calm as always. His presence alone carried weight, not because he was loud, not because he was aggressive, but because he never needed to be. Even through a screen, his voice was controlled, steady, and cold. "Ms. Keaton," he said evenly, "do you understand why you're here?" Ms. Keaton's pulse pounded in her ears. She clasped her hands together and forced herself to stay composed. "Sir, I assure you, there was a misunderstanding. The passenger—" "My daughter," Idris corrected, his voice sharp as a blade. Ms. Keaton's heart skipped. "Your daughter," she corrected quickly, "was never intentionally denied service. There was a timing issue." "I don't believe that." The way he said it left no room for argument. "We have received multiple accounts from both passengers and staff regarding your behavior," Damon added, his tone just as unforgiving. "You were given an opportunity to correct your mistake. Instead, you offered a weak apology and refused to acknowledge the real issue." Ms. Keaton's fingers twitched. "With all due respect, sir, I was simply following standard procedure. The situation has been resolved." Idris tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Tell me, Ms. Keaton, when you looked at Zahara, what exactly did you see?" Ms. Keaton hesitated. I don't understand the question." "I think you do," Idris said, "because when you looked at her, you made a decision. You didn't question anyone else's seat. You didn't refuse service to anyone else. But when it came to my daughter, you assumed she didn't belong." The words hit her harder than she expected. She wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself, but Idris wasn't shouting. He wasn't insulting her. He was simply stating a fact, one she couldn't escape from. The silence in the cockpit stretched. Damon finally spoke again. "You will return to your position for the remainder of this flight. Upon landing, you are to report directly to airline headquarters for a formal review. Do you understand?" Ms. Keaton nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "And Ms. Keaton," Idris added, his tone even softer now, "I suggest you start thinking very carefully about how you're going to explain yourself. Because as of right now, your career is hanging by a thread." The screen went dark. The room was suddenly too quiet. Captain Foster let out a slow breath, then turned to Ms. Keaton. "You should get back to work." Ms. Keaton nodded stiffly and turned to leave. But as she stepped out of the cockpit, she knew work wouldn't save her now. Ms. Keaton stepped out of the cockpit, but this time, she didn't walk with the same authority she once had. Her posture was rigid, her face stiff, but inside her mind was spiraling. A formal review, direct orders from the airline's owner, passengers watching her every move. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was the beginning of something much worse. As she made her way back to the first-class cabin, the weight of the situation settled over her like a storm cloud. She had always taken pride in her ability to stay in control, to keep order in the cabin, to make decisions without question. But now she had lost control. She wasn't the one enforcing the rules anymore. She was the one being watched. When she reached Zahara's seat, she hesitated for a fraction of a second before crouching slightly to meet her at eye level. "Miss Idris," she said, forcing her voice to stay neutral, "here is your orange juice." Zahara looked at the glass in front of her, then slowly back up at Miss Keaton. Her face didn't show much emotion, but the pause before she responded made Ms. Keaton's skin prickle with discomfort. "You seem nervous," Zahara said, her voice quiet. Ms. Keaton's fingers tightened around the tray she was holding. "I just want to ensure you receive the service you are entitled to," she replied. Zahara didn't take the glass immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. "Why now?" Ms. Keaton blinked. "Excuse me. You had juice before," Zahara continued, her tone steady. "You had plenty. You poured it for everyone else. You skipped me on purpose. And when I asked, you lied. And now suddenly you're bringing me what I asked for. Why?" The question made Ms. Keaton's stomach twist. She had been hoping that simply delivering the drink would make the moment pass quickly, that Zahara would take it and move on. But the girl wasn't letting her off that easy. Passengers around them were listening now, eyes flickering toward the interaction. A businessman 2 seats away shifted slightly, stealing a glance from behind his laptop. Elise, who had been refilling drinks a few rows back, stopped what she was doing and turned slightly toward them, watching. Miss Keaton swallowed. "I told you, it was a misunderstanding." Zahara's expression remained unchanged. "No, it wasn't." The silence stretched between them. Zahara finally reached for the glass, but before she lifted it, she spoke one last time. "You made a choice." Ms. Keaton felt her throat tighten. She had spent years enforcing policies, deciding who got what, who was worth extra effort and who wasn't. She had done it without thinking, but this time, she had been caught, and now there was no escaping it. Zahara took a slow sip of her juice, then placed the glass down with a quiet clink. She didn't need to say anything else. The silence was enough. Miss Keaton stood up stiffly and turned away, making her way back to the galley. But as she walked, she felt something she had never felt before. She wasn't in charge anymore, and everyone knew it. Miss Keaton's steps were quick and stiff as she walked back toward the galley, her hands clenched at her sides. The moment she passed through the curtain, she exhaled sharply, gripping the counter for support. The pressure in her chest felt suffocating. She had been humiliated in front of the entire first-class cabin by a teenager. Elise stood at the other end of the galley watching her carefully. She had seen Ms. Keaton handle plenty of difficult passengers before, but never like this. Never with this kind of tension, this kind of weight pressing down on her. "Rough moment?" Elise asked, her voice unreadable. Ms. Keaton shot her a sharp look. "Not now, Elise." Elise shrugged but didn't move. "You know, she didn't even have to raise her voice," she said. "That's what's really bothering you, isn't it?" Ms. Keaton let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I don't need a lecture from you." "No, I don't think you need a lecture," Elise replied, crossing her arms. "I think you need to realize that the way you've been treating people, it finally caught up with you." Ms. Keaton's jaw tightened. "I treated her the same way I would have treated anyone." Elise raised an eyebrow. "Really? Then why did you only refuse service to her?" The words hit deeper than Ms. Keaton expected. For a moment, she considered snapping back with a sharp response. Something to end the conversation, to shut Elise down. But nothing came. Because deep down, she knew Elise was right. Ms. Keaton turned away, pretending to adjust a stack of cups. Her mind raced, searching for something, anything, that would make this feel less like her fault. But she couldn't find it. Her reflection in the metal panel of the galley cabinet stared back at her, and for the first time, she saw herself from the outside. A flight attendant who had spent years believing she was untouchable. A woman who had made assumptions about passengers without thinking twice. And now she was the one under scrutiny. A chime from the in-flight phone made both women turn their heads. Ms. Keaton hesitated before reaching for it. "This is Ms. Keaton." The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Ms. Keaton, this is Captain Foster. Just letting you know we've received additional instructions from ground control regarding your status after landing. You are to remain on board until further notice." Ms. Keaton's stomach turned. "Remain on board?" "That's correct," the captain confirmed. "Security will be waiting at the gate. You'll be escorted for a formal meeting with airline management." The line clicked off. Elise let out a slow breath. "Well," she muttered, "that's not good." Ms. Keaton's grip on the phone tightened, but she didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. Because for the first time in her entire career, she wasn't sure if she'd still have a job by the time this flight landed. Ms. Keaton placed the phone back on the hook, but her fingers trembled slightly as she let go. The air in the galley felt stifling, as if the walls had closed in on her. Security, formal meeting, ground control. The words echoed in her mind like a warning siren. She had spent years ensuring passengers followed the rules, making sure things were done her way. But now she was the one under orders. She was the one being watched, scrutinized, judged. And the worst part? She had no control over what happened next. Elise was still standing nearby, pretending to wipe down the counter, but it was clear she was waiting for a reaction. She wasn't gloating, but there was something knowing in her expression, something that told Miss Keaton she had seen this coming long before today. Ms. Keaton let out a slow, controlled breath and straightened her uniform. "I need to finish my shift," she muttered, mostly to herself. Elise scoffed. "You think handing out a few more drinks is going to change anything?" Ms. Keaton ignored her and stepped back into the first-class cabin. But this time, everything felt different. The moment she entered the aisle, she felt it. The shift. Passengers weren't just watching her, they were judging her. She could feel their eyes tracking her every move, quiet whispers passing between them. She had never minded being the center of attention before. She had always been the one in charge, the one who set the tone of the cabin. But now the power dynamic had flipped. For the first time, she was the outsider. She moved stiffly, forcing a polite smile as she adjusted a tray on a passenger's table. The man barely nodded at her, his expression unreadable. Across the aisle, a woman in a gray blazer glanced at her, then looked away just as quickly. Zahara was still in her seat, scrolling through her phone, her face calm. She hadn't said a word since their last exchange, but she didn't need to. She had already done enough. Ms. Keaton took another step forward when she heard it. A whisper. It came from behind her, barely above the hum of the plane. "That's the one." The words sent a cold chill down her spine. She didn't turn around, didn't react. But she knew. People were talking. The story had already started spreading. Passengers had seen what happened, and now they were sharing it. Quietly, subtly, but it was happening. Ms. Keaton had always believed she was untouchable, that no matter how she handled a situation, the airline would back her. But now she wasn't so sure. She swallowed the knot in her throat and kept walking, pretending not to hear the whispers, pretending not to feel the stares burning into her back. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, one thought kept creeping back into her mind. This wasn't going away, and with every passing minute, it was only getting worse. Ms. Keaton moved robotically through the aisle, forcing herself to continue the routine of service, but everything felt off. Her hands weren't as steady, her voice wasn't as firm, and the forced politeness in her tone no longer held the same weight. The passengers could feel it too, the shift in power, the uncomfortable energy lingering in the air. A businessman in seat 2C cleared his throat as she passed, his eyes flicking towards Zahara before settling on Ms. Keaton. "Not your best moment, was it?" he muttered under his breath. Ms. Keaton stiffened, her fingers tightening around the tray she was holding. She didn't respond. She couldn't. She quickly turned toward another passenger, an older woman in seat 4A, and forced a smile. "Can I offer you anything else, ma'am?" The woman barely looked up from her book. "Just water, please." Miss Keaton reached for a bottle, but as she placed it on the tray table, the woman spoke again, softly without looking at her. "I saw what happened." The words sent a fresh wave of unease through Ms. Keaton's chest. She swallowed hard. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice neutral. The woman finally met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "I've been flying first class for years. I know how things work. I know who gets treated a certain way and who doesn't." She paused as if considering whether or not to say more. Then in a tone that was neither cruel nor kind, she added, "You made a mistake today." Miss Keaton felt heat rise up her neck. The way the woman spoke, calm, matter-of-fact, with quiet certainty, made it worse. There was no accusation, no anger, just the undeniable truth. A mistake. The words lingered in Miss Keaton's mind as she stepped away, trying to steady her breathing. She wasn't used to feeling exposed like this. She was the one who controlled the cabin, not the one who got whispered about. She turned toward the galley, needing a moment to breathe. But just as she did, she caught sight of something that made her stomach drop. Elise was standing near Zahara's seat, and she was handing her a fresh glass of orange juice. Miss Keaton froze. Zahara accepted the drink with a small nod, not looking surprised at all. Elise spoke softly, but Ms. Keaton couldn't make out the words from where she stood. Then before walking away, Elise did something unexpected. She placed a small pack of cookies on Zahara's tray, a quiet, simple gesture. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it did, because it was more than just an act of kindness. It was a statement. Miss Keaton clenched her jaw, her heart pounding. Elise had just undermined her. Not in an obvious, confrontational way, but in a way that sent a clear message to everyone watching. Zahara deserved better. Miss Keaton turned sharply and stormed back toward the galley, her hands shaking with frustration. She slammed the tray down on the counter, gripping the edge so hard that her nails dug into the metal surface. Elise followed a moment later, her expression unreadable. What the hell was that? Miss Keaton snapped, keeping her voice low but furious. Elise leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. What was what? Miss Keaton's eyes burned with anger. You went behind my back. Elise shrugged. I did my job. No, you didn't. Miss Keaton's voice was sharper now. You deliberately corrected me in front of passengers. Elise didn't flinch. Because you were wrong. The words landed like a slap. Miss Keaton let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. You have no idea what you've just done. Elise tilted her head slightly. Oh, I think I do. Miss Keaton narrowed her eyes. You think this makes you a hero? Elise sighed, her voice quieter now. Number. But I think for the first time, someone held you accountable, and you don't know how to handle it. Miss Keaton stared at her, breathing heavily. She had spent years in control, years making decisions without question. But now everything was slipping away. And Elise was right. She didn't know how to handle it. She didn't know what to do. For the first time in her career, she was powerless. Ms. Keaton stood frozen in the galley, her hands gripping the counter as Elise's words echoed in her mind. For the first time, someone held you accountable, and you don't know how to handle it. It wasn't the words themselves that stung. It was the fact that they were true. Her entire career, she had been the one in control. The one who dictated the rules, who decided which passengers deserved courtesy and which ones didn't. She had built her authority on that unshakable confidence, on the belief that she knew best. But now, for the first time, she had been forced to answer for something she had done, and she hated it. Elise, still standing across from her, watched her carefully. There was no gloating, no satisfaction in her expression, just a quiet understanding, as if she had been waiting for this moment to happen for a long time. Ms. Keaton inhaled sharply, straightening her shoulders. You think I'm the villain here, don't you? Elise didn't react right away. She seemed to consider the question before responding. I think you made a decision without thinking about what it really meant. And now, you don't like that you're facing the consequences. Ms. Keaton let out a dry, humorless laugh. Consequences? She shook her head. Over a glass of juice. Elise's eyes darkened slightly. It was never about the juice, and you know it. Silence stretched between them. Ms. Keaton wanted to argue, wanted to shift the blame, wanted to find any excuse that would make this not her fault, but she couldn't, because deep down, she knew exactly what she had done, and now everyone else did too. She turned away from Elise, needing a moment to compose herself. But just as she was about to grab a fresh tray and distract herself with work, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are beginning our descent and will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. A slow, cold dread settled in Ms. Keaton's stomach. Landing. The flight would be over soon, and the moment the doors opened, she knew what would be waiting for her. Security, a formal meeting, a panel of executives who would be expecting an explanation. An explanation she didn't have. Her hands felt clammy as she reached for a water bottle, unscrewing the cap with slightly unsteady fingers. Elise watched her, then let out a quiet sigh. You should start thinking about what you're going to say. Ms. Keaton scoffed, though the sound was weaker than she intended. And what would you suggest? Elise shrugged. I don't know. Maybe the truth. Ms. Keaton's jaw tightened. She took a long sip of water, avoiding Elise's gaze. The truth. Could she even say it out loud? That she had looked at Zahara and made a judgment before she had even spoken? That she had assumed in an instant that the girl didn't belong in first class? That she had treated her differently not because of a mistake, but because of a choice? The thought made her chest tighten. She wasn't ready for that. She wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for that. A ding from the overhead speakers signaled the final descent. Ms. Keaton inhaled sharply and turned to adjust the supplies one last time, as if carrying out her usual duties would somehow make this flight end differently. But no matter how much she tried to delay the inevitable, one thing was clear. She had run the cabin for years, but now someone else was running her fate, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The plane dipped slightly as it began its descent, the engines humming steadily as the runway came into view. A quiet murmur spread through the cabin as passengers adjusted their seatbelts, tucked away their belongings, and prepared for landing. To most, this was just another routine flight coming to an end. But for Ms. Keaton, this landing felt like a countdown to something she wasn't ready to face. She kept her movements controlled, her expression neutral, as she moved through the first-class cabin, checking passengers' seatbelts and tray tables. It was an automatic task, one she had done hundreds of times before. But this time, every step felt heavier. Every glance from a passenger felt like a silent judgment. She stopped near Zahara's row. The girl was calm, her seatbelt already fastened, her phone resting in her hand as she absent-mindedly scrolled through messages. She didn't look up. She didn't need to, because for the first time, Ms. Keaton was the one waiting to be acknowledged. The shift in power was suffocating. She cleared her throat, trying to make her voice sound as normal as possible. "Miss Idris, are you comfortable for landing?" Zahara finally looked up. There was no hostility in her gaze, no outward sign of anger, just a quiet certainty, a confidence that made Ms. Keaton feel small in a way she never had before. "I'm fine," Zahara said simply. Then after a pause, she added, "Are you?" The question made Ms. Keaton's breath catch for just a second. Was she? She forced a stiff nod. "Of course." Zahara held her gaze for a moment longer before returning to her phone, dismissing her without another word. That dismissal cut deeper than an insult ever could. Ms. Keaton turned quickly and walked toward the front of the cabin, her heart pounding harder with every second. She wanted to get through landing, wanted to step off this plane and disappear before things got any worse. But deep down, she knew that wasn't an option. This wasn't just about Zahara anymore. It was bigger than that. Passengers had witnessed everything. The whispers had already started. People had seen the way she treated Zahara, the way she had avoided responsibility, the way she had been forced into an apology she didn't want to give. And soon word would spread beyond this cabin. She had spent her entire career making sure things ran smoothly, controlling how passengers saw her, ensuring she was always the one in charge. But now, for the first time, her reputation was no longer in her hands. A soft ding overhead signaled the final approach. The plane tilted slightly as it lined up with the runway, and Ms. Keaton reached for the intercom, her fingers trembling slightly as she made the final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we arrive at the gate." Her voice was steady, but inside she felt like she was unraveling. She placed the intercom back onto its holder and turned toward the galley, needing a moment to breathe. But before she could take a step, the in-flight phone buzzed again. She hesitated. She already knew who it was before she even picked up. Slowly, she reached for the receiver. "This is Ms. Keaton." A pause, then a deep, controlled voice came through the line. "This is Idris." A sharp, ice-cold chill spread through her chest. She had spoken to executives before. She had even handled difficult complaints from high-status passengers, but never directly from the owner of the airline. Her throat was dry. "Yes, sir." Another pause. Then his voice came again, calm, controlled, deadly in its precision. "You will remain on board after landing. My team will be waiting for you at the gate." Miss Keaton felt her fingers tremble around the phone. "Sir, this is not up for discussion." The line clicked off. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just facing a passenger complaint. She was facing something much worse. As the plane descended toward the runway, the airport lights coming into view, Ms. Keaton stared blankly ahead, her heart pounding with a new kind of fear. She had spent years enforcing rules, deciding who deserved what, believing she would never have to answer for the way she treated people. But now she was the one being called to answer, and there was no way out. The plane touched down with a soft but final thud, the tires screeching slightly against the runway. The familiar pull of gravity pushed everyone slightly forward in their seats as the aircraft slowed to a controlled taxi toward the gate. Normally, this was the part of the flight where relief set in. Another journey completed, another set of passengers delivered safely to their destination. But for Ms. Keaton, this wasn't an ending. This was the beginning of something much worse. She stood stiffly near the galley, gripping the counter to steady herself as the plane taxied toward the terminal. The seconds stretched unbearably, each moment bringing her closer to whatever was waiting for her on the other side of the cabin doors. She had heard stories before, flight attendants who had been disciplined, those who had been let go quietly after a serious passenger complaint. But those cases had involved regular customers. This was different. This was Idris, the owner of the entire airline. And Zahara wasn't just another passenger. She was his daughter. Ms. Keaton swallowed hard, her pulse loud in her ears. The overhead ding signaled the seatbelt sign turning off, and like clockwork, passengers began unbuckling and stretching, some reaching for their bags in the overhead compartments. The usual soft murmur of conversation filled the cabin, but this time there was something different in the air. People weren't just talking about their layovers or their next destinations. They were talking about her. She could feel it. She caught snippets of hushed voices as she walked toward the front of the cabin. "She's in trouble for sure. Did you see how she handled that girl? Unbelievable. I knew something was up the moment she got called to the cockpit." Ms. Keaton forced her expression to remain neutral, her hands locked together tightly in front of her. She wouldn't let them see her panic. But it wasn't just the whispers. The looks were worse. Passengers stole glances at her, some brief, some lingering, but all of them carrying the same unspoken message. They knew. She turned slightly, her gaze landing on Zahara. The girl was still seated, calm, composed, completely unbothered by the chaos around her. She had made no effort to rush off the plane, no attempt to blend into the crowd. She was waiting. Waiting for exactly what, Miss Keaton didn't know. And that terrified her. A loud knock from outside the aircraft made her jump slightly. She turned her head just in time to see the jet bridge connecting to the cabin door. The sound of the latch unlocking sent another wave of unease crawling up her spine. The doors opened, and the usual first-class passengers were expected to disembark first. Some moved quickly, eager to get on with their travels, while others lingered just a little longer than necessary, just long enough to steal a final look at Miss Keaton before stepping off the plane. She turned away, feeling a prickle of heat on her neck. Then just as she was about to move toward the front, a uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane. A hush settled over the passengers still inside the cabin. The officer, a tall man with a broad frame, scanned the area before his gaze settled on her. "Ms. Keaton?" Her entire body stiffened. The moment she had been dreading was here. She nodded quickly, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Yes?" The officer's tone remained professional, but firm. "I'm going to need you to come with me." Passengers still seated in first class stopped moving. Conversations went silent. Even the air inside the cabin felt thicker, heavier. For years, Ms. Keaton had been the one with authority. She had been the one calling the shots, deciding how passengers were treated, making the rules as she saw fit. But now she was the one being escorted off the plane. She tried to keep her steps measured, her back straight, her expression unreadable as she walked toward the exit. But she felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her. As she passed Zahara's row, she didn't look at her. But she knew the girl was watching. She could feel it. For the first time in her career, Miss Keaton wasn't just stepping off a plane. She was walking straight into the consequences of her own actions. Miss Keaton stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool air hitting her skin as she followed the security officer in the stiff, controlled movements. The familiar hum of the airport surrounded her, the distant chatter of passengers, the occasional announcement over the intercom. But everything felt muted, distant. Her mind raced as she tried to prepare herself for what was coming. A formal meeting, a panel of executives. Idris. She had never met the man in person, only seen his name in company-wide emails or heard about him in conversations among senior staff. He was known for running his airline with precision, for making sure every detail, every employee, every rule was followed to perfection. And she had just mistreated his daughter. She clenched her jaw, trying to keep her panic from surfacing. There had to be a way to fix this. Maybe she could argue that Zahara had exaggerated, that the passengers had misunderstood. Maybe she could frame it as a simple service mistake rather than intentional discrimination. But deep down, she knew none of that would work. This wasn't just about Zahara anymore. This was about everyone who had watched it happen. Passengers had seen it. Elise had seen it. The whispers had already started. And once a reputation like this started spreading, it never stopped. The security officer led her through a private corridor, away from the usual passenger exits. The hallway was eerily quiet. the fluorescent lights above flickering slightly as they walked. The further they went, the heavier Miss Keaton's footsteps felt. Finally, they reached a large conference room with glass walls. Inside, she saw 4 executives seated at a long table. One of them was Damon Whitaker, the senior operations manager she had spoken to earlier. His expression was unreadable, but the way his fingers tapped against the table suggested impatience. And at the head of the table, seated with his hands folded neatly in front of him, was Idris. Miss Keaton felt her stomach tighten. The security officer gestured toward the door. "You can go in now." Her mouth was dry as she stepped inside. The door shut behind her with a soft but final click. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was suffocating. Then Idris lifted his gaze to meet hers. His expression was unreadable, calm, controlled, but dangerous in its stillness. Finally, he spoke. "Sit." The single word felt heavier than an entire speech. Miss Keaton swallowed hard and obeyed, lowering herself into the chair directly across from him. Her hands rested on her lap, her fingers curling slightly against the fabric of her uniform. Idris studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you understand why you're here?" Miss Keaton nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I do." "Then tell me." His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. "Why are you here?" Miss Keaton hesitated. "Choose your words carefully," she told herself. "There was a misunderstanding during the flight, sir." No." The interruption was sharp, immediate. Her pulse quickened. Idris leaned slightly forward, his eyes locked onto hers. "You are not here because of a misunderstanding, Ms. Keaton. You are here because of a choice you made." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because he was right. He let the silence stretch, giving her a moment to absorb the weight of what he had just said. Then he continued. "You looked at my daughter. You saw her sitting in first class, and you made an assumption." His tone didn't rise, didn't waver. "You decided without checking her ticket, without speaking to her, that she didn't belong. And because of that decision, you treated her differently than every other passenger in that cabin." The room felt unbearably small. Damon Whitaker shifted slightly in his seat, flipping through a stack of papers. "We have statements from multiple passengers, including staff. Your colleague Elise reported that you made no effort to correct your actions, even after the situation was brought to your attention." Miss Keaton's nails dug into her palms. Idris tilted his head slightly. "Do you deny any of this?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to say that it wasn't that simple, that she hadn't meant anything by it, that it was a mistake blown out of proportion. But could she? Would that even help her now? Her mind spun, grasping at any possible defense, but there wasn't one. And for the first time since the moment she had refused Zahara that drink, she truly felt the weight of what she had done. Idris exhaled softly, leaning back in his chair. "You have worked for this airline for years, Miss Keaton. I assume you know our policies well?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, of course." He held her gaze. "Then you know that discrimination, whether conscious or unconscious, is not tolerated here. Ever." A sharp pressure built in her chest. Damon Whitaker slid a document across the table. "We are conducting an internal review of your actions. Effective immediately, you are suspended until further notice pending the results of this investigation." Ms. Keaton's breath hitched. "Suspended? Did you think you'd walk away from this with nothing?" Damon asked, his voice cool. She wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself, but the reality of the situation had already crashed over her, like a wave. She had lost control. Idris stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket as he did. "You should take this time to think very carefully about what you've done, Miss Keaton." She stayed silent, her head lowering slightly. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The meeting was over, but for Ms. Keaton, this was just the beginning of the fallout. Ms. Keaton sat motionless, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. The words "suspended until further notice" echoed in her mind, looping endlessly, refusing to settle. She had spent years climbing the ranks, perfecting her authority in first class, ensuring that passengers followed the standards she set. She had controlled every flight, every interaction, every outcome. And now she was nothing more than an employee awaiting judgment. The executives had already begun gathering their documents, preparing to leave, their decision made. Damon Whitaker was flipping through a set of files, making quiet notes with a pen. The other two executives murmured softly to each other, their discussion no longer about her. She was no longer important. She had been dismissed. Miss Keaton swallowed hard, forcing herself to straighten her shoulders. "Sir," she said, her voice tight, "if I may—" Damon raised an eyebrow but didn't stop his writing. Idris, who had just reached the door, paused slightly and turned back to look at her. His expression remained unreadable. Miss Keaton inhaled, trying to calm the panic rising in her chest. "I understand that my actions today were seen as unacceptable, but I have been a loyal employee of this airline for years. I've upheld every protocol, every standard. I've given everything to this company." She hesitated, her throat tightening. "Surely that counts for something?" Idris studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Do you believe your years of service justify what you did today?" Ms. Keaton's stomach twisted. "No, sir. Then why bring it up?" His voice wasn't loud. He hadn't even raised it, but somehow it crushed her more than if he had shouted. Miss Keaton's nails dug into her palms. "I made a mistake," she admitted, struggling to keep her voice even. "No," Idris corrected smoothly, stepping forward. "A mistake is when you spill coffee on a passenger. A mistake is when you misplace a meal order. What you did was not a mistake. It was a choice." Her breath hitched slightly. "You saw my daughter sitting in first class and decided she wasn't supposed to be there." Idris continued, his eyes locked onto hers. "You didn't check her ticket. You didn't ask a question. You made an assumption. And then, even when you had the chance to correct it, you didn't. You doubled down. You dismissed her. You treated her as if she was invisible." Ms. Keaton clenched her jaw. "And you know what the worst part is?" Idris asked, tilting his head slightly. She didn't answer. "This is probably not the first time you've done it," he said quietly. "It's just the first time you got caught." The words hit harder than anything else he had said before. A sharp, suffocating silence filled the room. She wanted to protest, to insist that he was wrong, that she had never done this before. But had she? Had she ignored other passengers in the past because she assumed they didn't belong? Had she overlooked certain requests because, deep down, she didn't think those passengers deserved the same level of service? Had she done this without realizing it? Or worse, had she known all along? Her pulse pounded in her ears. Damon Whitaker slid another document toward her. "You will be contacted with further instructions about your review process. Until then, you are not to report for duty." Miss Keaton barely heard him. Her mind was stuck, repeating Idris's words over and over again. "This is not the first time you've done it. It's just the first time you got caught." She had always seen herself as an authority figure, someone who kept the order, who set the tone of the cabin. She had never questioned how she set that tone, never thought twice about the subtle ways she controlled who was treated with respect and who wasn't. She had believed she was untouchable. But now she was being forced to face the truth of who she really was. The meeting was over. The executives stood, gathering their things. Idris gave her one last glance, then walked out of the room without another word. Ms. Keaton sat frozen in her chair, her hands still curled into fists. For years, she had dictated the rules of first class. Now, for the first time, she was being judged by them. And this time, she wouldn't be the one deciding her own fate. If you like this story, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.